The jungle of 442B was not like the jungles of Earth. The trees grew sideways before turning upward, their trunks twisting in strange spiral patterns that reached toward the pale green sky. The leaves were not green but deep purple, and they made a soft humming sound when the wind passed through them. Strange birds with 6 wings flew between the branches, and creatures that looked like a mix between a spider and a crab crawled along the ground. It was a beautiful world. It was also a deadly one. Lieutenant Commander Grace Murphy knew this better than anyone. She had been on this planet for 3 days now, ever since her shuttle had crashed in the northern hemisphere. The emergency beacon was damaged, and she had no way to contact her ship, the steady vessel that waited somewhere in orbit above. Her crew would be looking for her, she knew, but they would not find her quickly. The planet's atmosphere played tricks with sensors, and the jungle was thick enough to hide almost anything, including the hunting party that had been chasing her for the last 18 hours. Grace pressed herself against the trunk of a spiral tree and listened. Her ears, trained by 30 years of military service, picked up sounds that most humans would miss. The soft crunch of heavy feet on fallen leaves, the low rumble of alien voices speaking in a language that sounded like gravel being crushed, the excited panting of young hunters who thought they had found easy prey. She counted 7 distinct sets of footsteps, plus one heavier set that moved with more confidence. 8 hunters in total, 7 young ones and 1 adult leader. Grace looked down at her side, where a long gash ran from her ribs to her hip. The wound was deep but not fatal. One of the young hunters had gotten lucky with a blade about 6 hours ago. She had killed that one immediately after, snapping its neck with a move she had learned during her first year in the United Earth Navy. But the damage was done. She was bleeding, and on a world full of predators with enhanced senses, blood was like a signal fire. She reached into her survival pack and pulled out a small medical kit. Inside were basic supplies, bandages, antiseptic spray, pain medication, and a single canister of synthetic adrenaline. She used the antiseptic first, biting down on her sleeve to keep from crying out as the liquid burned through the wound. Then she wrapped the bandage tight around her torso, pulling it as firm as she could manage. The bleeding slowed but did not stop completely. That was fine. She did not need it to stop. She just needed to stay alive long enough to teach these hunters a lesson they would never forget. Grace Murphy was 52 years old. She had gray streaks in her dark hair and lines around her eyes from years of squinting at navigation screens. Her body was not as fast as it had been in her 20s, and her joints ached on cold mornings. By any reasonable measure, she should have been sitting behind a desk somewhere, pushing papers and counting down the days until retirement. But Grace had never been reasonable. She had joined the Navy at 18, fresh out of a small town in Montana, where the biggest excitement was watching the cargo ships pass overhead on their way to the orbital stations. She had wanted to see the stars, and the Navy had given her that chance. Over the next 3 decades, she had served on 12 different vessels, fought in 4 major conflicts, and earned a reputation as someone who simply refused to die. The siege of Titan Station had been the worst of it. 37 days trapped in a damaged section of the station with nothing but emergency rations and a broken plasma pistol. The enemy had sent soldiers to finish her off 6 different times. 6 times she had killed them and taken their supplies. When the rescue team finally broke through, they found her sitting calmly in the command center, surrounded by the bodies of her enemies, reading a book she had found in one of their packs. That was 12 years ago. Since then, Grace had been promoted twice, given command of her own ship, and sent on countless missions to the far edges of human space. She had seen wonders that most people could not imagine. She had also seen horrors that kept her awake some nights. But she had never seen anything quite like There were a species that humanity had first encountered about 15 years ago. They were tall, standing nearly 8 feet on average, with digitigrade legs that bent backward at the knee like a dog's. Their bodies were covered in short silver fur, and their faces were a strange mix of wolf and bear, with long snouts full of sharp teeth and small ears that sat flat against their skulls. Their eyes were yellow with vertical pupils, and they glowed faintly in the dark. They were also, according to their own culture, the greatest hunters in the galaxy. Grace had read the reports during her briefings. They did not fight wars the way humans did. They did not build massive fleets or develop weapons of mass destruction. Instead, they hunted. Their entire society was built around the concept of the hunt, and their young were required to participate in a ritual called the Rite of First Blood before they could be considered adults. The rite was simple. A group of young would be sent to hunt and kill a sentient being from another species. The kill had to be made with traditional weapons, blades and spears, rather than guns or energy weapons. The species chosen for the hunt was supposed to be one that the considered inferior, weak creatures that would provide a suitable challenge for untrained cubs without being genuinely dangerous. Humans were apparently considered perfect targets. Grace found this amusing in a dark sort of way. They had studied humanity from a distance and decided that they were soft, slow, and lacking in natural weapons. No claws, no fangs, no armored skin. Humans did not even have good night vision or a strong sense of smell. On paper, they seemed like ideal prey. What they had failed to understand was that humans had not become the dominant species on Earth because of their physical abilities. They had done it through something far more dangerous, their minds. Humans were problem solvers. They were tool users. They were creatures who looked at a challenge and immediately began figuring out how to overcome it. And more than anything else, humans were survivors. Grace had spent the last 18 hours proving this point. The hunting party had found her trail shortly after dawn on the second day, and they had been chasing her ever since. She had led them through the densest parts of the jungle, across rivers full of acid water, and over cliffs that would have killed any creature that lost its footing. 3 of the original hunting party had died during the chase, not from her actions but from the planet itself. The remaining 8 were more careful now. They moved slowly, checking every step before they took it. They were learning. But they were not learning fast enough. Grace waited until the footsteps grew closer. Then she began to move. She did not run, because running would make noise and leave an obvious trail. Instead, she walked with careful, deliberate steps, placing her feet on rocks and roots where they would leave no prints. She moved in a wide circle, looping around behind the hunting party while they continued forward toward her previous position. It took her about 20 minutes to complete the circle. By the time she was done, she was positioned directly behind the last hunter in the group, a young male who kept looking around nervously as he walked. Grace studied him for a moment. He was smaller than the others, probably the youngest of the group. His silver fur was slightly darker than his companions', and he held his blade with an uncertain grip that suggested he had not used it much in actual combat. He was scared, she realized. Scared and trying hard not to show it. For a moment, she felt something like sympathy. He was just a child, really. A child sent to kill something that was supposed to be helpless. Then she remembered the gash in her side, and the 6 hours of agony she had endured while fleeing through the jungle. The sympathy faded. Grace reached into her pack and pulled out the plasma cutter. It was a small tool designed for cutting through metal panels during repair work, but it made an excellent weapon in a pinch. The blade was only about 6 inches long, but it was hot enough to slice through almost anything. She activated it with a soft click and moved forward. The young never saw her coming. She came up behind him like a shadow, wrapped one arm around his neck to keep him from crying out, and drove the plasma cutter into the base of his skull. The blade punched through bone and brain matter with a soft hiss, and the hunter went limp in her arms. She lowered him gently to the ground, making as little noise as possible. Then she retrieved the plasma cutter and wiped it clean on his fur. 7 left. Grace moved into the undergrowth and began setting her traps. The monofilament wire was something she had invented herself, back during her early days in the Navy. It was made from a special material that was almost impossible to see with the naked eye, and it was strong enough to cut through flesh and bone with ease. She had about 50 feet of it in her pack, which was more than enough for what she had planned. She strung the first wire between 2 trees at neck height the second wire went about 3 feet lower, at chest height. The third went at knee height. She repeated this pattern in a rough semicircle around a small clearing, creating a deadly maze of invisible blades. Then she walked into the center of the clearing and sat down. She was tired, Her wound was still bleeding, and the adrenaline from her earlier escape was starting to fade. Her body wanted to sleep, to rest, to recover. But she could not afford to do any of those things. Not yet. Instead, she pulled out the canister of synthetic adrenaline and studied it carefully. The label warned against using more than one dose in a 24-hour period. Side effects could include heart failure, stroke, and permanent nerve damage. Grace had already used one dose about 18 hours ago when the hunting party had first found her trail. She had roughly 6 hours until she could safely use another. She put the canister away and pulled out her water bottle instead. There was not much left, maybe enough for a few more hours. After that, she would need to find a stream or risk dehydration. One problem at a time, she told herself. First, deal with the hunters, then worry about water. She took a small sip and settled in to wait. The hunting party found her about 40 minutes later. Pack leader was the first to enter the clearing. He was massive, easily 9 feet tall, with silver fur that had turned white around his muzzle from age. His eyes were sharp and intelligent, and he carried himself with the confidence of a creature who had never been defeated. He stopped at the edge of the clearing and studied the human sitting in the center. She was small, even by human standards, with dark hair streaked with gray and a face that showed signs of age and exhaustion. Her clothing was torn and stained with blood, and she sat with her back against a rock, seemingly unable to move. She looked like easy prey. Had been hunting for over 200 years. He had killed creatures on 100 different worlds, from massive beasts that towered over him to cunning predators that could match his speed and strength. He had trained countless cubs in the art of the hunt, and he had never lost a single one under his care. Until today. He had found the body of Young about 20 minutes ago, hidden in the undergrowth with a hole burned through his skull. The wound was small and precise, the work of a tool rather than a weapon. The human had done it, somehow sneaking up behind the boy without being detected. That should not have been possible. Had senses that far exceeded those of humans. They could hear heartbeats from 100 feet away. They could smell blood on the wind from miles distant. They could see in near-complete darkness and track prey through the thickest jungle. And yet this human had managed to kill one of his cubs without any of them noticing. Was beginning to suspect that he had made a serious mistake in choosing this particular human as their target. The 6 remaining cubs gathered behind him, their eyes fixed on the wounded human in the clearing. They were nervous, he could smell it on them, but they were also eager. They wanted to finish this hunt and return home as adults. They wanted to prove themselves. He understood the feeling. He had felt the same way during his own first hunt, so many years ago. But he had also learned something important during his long life. The most dangerous prey was the one that stopped running. And this human had stopped running. The eldest of the remaining cubs stepped forward. He was 16 cycles old, tall and strong and confident in the way that only the young could be. He was also, in his opinion, somewhat foolish. "She is wounded and weak," said his voice carrying across the clearing. "I will make the killing blow." Reached out and grabbed the young hunter's arm before he could move. "Wait." Looked back at him with confusion. "Pack leader, she is right there, she cannot escape." "Then why has she stopped running?" The question hung in the air. The cubs looked at each other uncertainly. None of them had an answer. Studied the human carefully. She had not moved since they arrived, but he could see that her eyes were open and alert. She was watching them, he realized. Watching and waiting. "For what?" "Spread out," he ordered. "Circle the clearing, but do not enter it. I want to see what she is planning." The cubs obeyed, moving through the undergrowth in a loose circle. Remained at the edge of the clearing, his eyes never leaving the human. She smiled at him. It was not a friendly smile. It was not the smile of someone who was scared or desperate or ready to surrender. It was the smile of someone who knew something that he did not. Felt the fur on the back of his neck rise. He was about to call the cubs back when the first one died. Had been moving through the undergrowth on the left side of the clearing when something invisible sliced through his neck. He did not even have time to cry out. His head simply fell from his shoulders, and his body continued forward for 3 more steps before collapsing. The other cubs started screaming. 2 more died in the next few seconds, caught by wires strung at different heights. One lost both arms at the elbows and bled out in seconds. The other was cut in half at the waist, his upper body tumbling to the ground while his legs remained standing for a horrible moment before toppling over. Roared for the cubs to stop moving, but they were too panicked to listen. They crashed through the undergrowth in random directions, trying to escape the invisible death that surrounded them. Another cub hit a wire and lost his leg. He screamed and fell, clutching the stump where his limb had been. A moment later, a second wire caught him across the throat and silenced him forever. 5 cubs dead in less than 30 seconds. Stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This was not hunting. This was slaughter. The human rose to her feet. She moved slowly, favoring her wounded side, but her eyes were sharp and focused. She held a small tool in her right hand, something that glowed with a faint orange light. Her face was calm, almost peaceful, as she walked toward the edge of the clearing. "Stay back," warned her. "Stay back or I will kill you." She laughed. It was a soft sound, almost gentle, but there was nothing gentle in her eyes. "You have been trying to kill me for 18 hours, she said. Her voice was steady, despite the wound in her side and the blood that stained her clothing. "How is that working out for you?" Looked around the clearing. 5 of his cubs were dead, cut apart by traps he had not even seen. One more was somewhere in the jungle behind him, killed earlier by the same human who now stood before him. Only remained, hiding somewhere in the undergrowth to his right. 6 cubs dead, 1 remaining, and the hunt was not even close to over. He had led hunting parties for over 100 years. He had never lost more than 1 or 2 cubs during a hunt, and those losses had always been due to accidents or bad luck. This was something different. This was a systematic destruction of his entire group by a single wounded human. It should not have been possible. "What are you?" he asked. The human tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question. "My name is Grace Murphy. I am a lieutenant commander in the United Earth Navy. I have served my species for 30 years, and I have survived things that would have killed most creatures in this galaxy." She took another step toward him and found himself stepping back. He was not sure why. She was small and wounded and alone. He was a pack leader with 200 years of experience. He should not have been afraid of her. But he was. "You chose me as your prey," Grace continued. "You and your cubs, you looked at me and saw something weak and helpless, something you could hunt down and kill without any real danger." She smiled again, and this time there was something cold and terrible in it. "You were wronged." Burst from the undergrowth to Grace's right, her blade raised for a killing strike. She was fast, faster than any human could ever hope to be, and her blade was aimed directly at the human's heart. Grace did not even look at her. She simply pivoted on her heel, ducked under the wild swing, and drove her plasma cutter into the young hunter's throat. The blade punched through flesh and bone, and its eyes went wide with shock and pain. She tried to speak, but only blood came out. Grace pulled the blade free and let the young fall. 7 cubs dead. Stared at the body of his last remaining cub, his mind refusing to accept what he had just witnessed. Had been the fastest of the group, the most skilled with a blade. She had been moving at full speed, attacking from behind. And the human had killed her without even looking. "How?" he whispered. Grace turned to face him. Her face was spattered with blood and her breathing was heavy, but her eyes were calm. "I heard her coming about 10 seconds before she attacked. Your species may have good senses, but you make a lot of noise when you move." She took another step toward him, and realized that he was now completely alone with the creature that had just killed 7 of his cubs. "I am going to give you a choice," Grace said. "You can run and I will let you go. You can return to your people and tell them what happened here. Tell them that humans are not prey. Tell them that we are something else entirely." She raised the plasma cutter, and its orange glow illuminated her face in the growing darkness. "Or you can fight me, and you can die like the rest of your pack." looked at the human standing before him. She was wounded and tired and covered in blood. By every physical measure, he should have been able to kill her easily. He was bigger, stronger, faster, and armed with weapons designed for exactly this purpose. But she had already killed 7 of his cubs. 7 trained hunters, each of them capable of taking down creatures twice their size. She had done it with nothing but a small cutting tool and some wire. What could she do to him? The answer, he realized, was anything she wanted. Made his choice, he turned and ran. He crashed through the jungle without looking back, his powerful legs carrying him faster than any human could follow. He leaped over fallen logs and ducked under low branches, his heart pounding in his chest. He did not stop running until he reached the edge of the jungle, where the trees gave way to open grassland. Only then did he allow himself to look back. The jungle was dark and silent. There was no sign of pursuit. The human had kept her word and let him go. Stood there for a long moment, trying to process what had happened. He had been hunting for over 200 years. He had never failed a hunt before. He had certainly never run from prey. But this human was not prey. She was something else, something that his people had never encountered before. He began the long walk back to the landing zone where his ship waited. He had a report to make, a warning to deliver. They had made a terrible mistake. Grace watched the pack leader disappear into the jungle, then she sat down heavily on a fallen log. The synthetic adrenaline was wearing off, and the pain in her side was coming back with a vengeance. Her hands were shaking, and her vision was starting to blur around the edges. She had maybe an hour before she lost consciousness. After that, the jungle would probably kill her. There were predators on this world that made them look like kittens, and she was in no condition to fight them off. She needed to find shelter. She needed to find water. She needed to do 100 different things if she wanted to survive long enough for rescue. But first, she needed to rest, just for a moment. She leaned back against the log and closed her eyes. The sounds of the jungle washed over her, strange and alien but almost peaceful. Somewhere in the distance, one of those 6-winged birds called out, its voice echoing through the trees. Grace thought about her crew, up there in orbit, searching for her. She thought about her family back on Earth, her sister and her nephews who she had not seen in 3 years. She thought about all the things she still wanted to do, all the places she still wanted to see. She was not ready to die. Not here, not like this, not on some alien world millions of miles from home. So she would not die. It was as simple as that. Grace opened her eyes and forced herself to stand. Her legs were weak and her wound was bleeding again, but she was still alive. That was all that mattered. She began walking toward the east, where she remembered seeing a river during her earlier flight through the jungle. Water first, then shelter, then a way to signal her ship. One step at a time, one problem at a time. That was how humans survived. Not through strength or speed or superior senses, through determination, through refusing to give up no matter how bad things got. They would learn this lesson, if not from her story, then from the next human they tried to hunt, and the one after that, and the one after that. Because humans never stopped, they never gave up, they never surrendered. And that made them the most dangerous predators in the galaxy. Grace walked through the jungle as the sun began to set, painting the purple leaves in shades of gold and red. She did not know how long it would take her to reach the river. She did not know if she would survive the night. She did not know if rescue would ever come. But she kept walking anyway, because that was what humans did. The High Council met 3 weeks after the incident on 442B. They gathered in the Great Chamber on there, a massive circular room carved from living rock, where the leaders of every major pack came to discuss matters of importance. Pack leader stood before them, his silver fur now showing more white than he remembered. The journey home had aged him. The memories had aged him more. "Tell us again what happened," demanded Elder, the oldest member of the council. "Tell us how a single human killed 7 trained hunters." Closed his eyes. He had told the story a dozen times already, and each telling made it worse. Each telling forced him to relive the horror of watching his cubs die, one by one, to an enemy they had completely underestimated. She used traps, he said. Wire that was nearly invisible, strung at different heights. The cubs ran into them without seeing. By the time we understood what was happening, 5 were already dead. And the other 2? She killed them directly. One she ambushed from behind early in the hunt. The other attacked her at the end, and she killed her without even looking. The human moved faster than I thought possible for their species. Elder leaned forward. You are saying that a wounded human female, alone and without proper weapons, killed 7 of your cubs and then allowed you to live? Yes. Why did she let you survive? Opened his eyes. She wanted me to deliver a message. She wanted us to know that humans are not what we thought they were. She wanted us to understand that they are not prey. The council chamber was silent. They had been hunting other species for thousands of years. They had faced creatures of all shapes and sizes, from mindless beasts to intelligent predators. They had always won. Their cubs had always returned home as adults, blooded and proud. Until now. What do you recommend? Asked another council member, a female named who led one of the largest packs on the... Did not hesitate. I recommend that we reclassify humans immediately. They are not prey. They are apex predators, as dangerous as any species we have ever encountered, perhaps more so. More so, they have no claws, no fangs, no natural weapons of any kind. How can they be more dangerous than creatures that do? Thought about the human woman, sitting calmly in that clearing with death strung around her in every direction. He thought about the look in her eyes when she smiled at him. He thought about the way she had moved, the way she had fought, the way she had refused to give up even when she was wounded and alone and facing impossible odds. Because they think differently than we do, he said finally. They do not fight the way we fight. They do not hunt the way we hunt. They use their minds to turn every disadvantage into an advantage, every weakness into a strength. They prepare, they plan, they adapt. He looked around the chamber at the assembled pack leaders, trying to make them understand what he had learned in that jungle. We sent cubs to hunt what we thought was helpless prey. The prey killed them all. 7 trained hunters dead in minutes, and the human who did it was wounded, alone, and armed with nothing but a cutting tool and some wire. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. Imagine what they could do if they came hunting us. The council chamber remained silent for a long moment. Then Elder spoke. We will take your recommendation under advisement, pack leader. In the meantime, all hunting parties are to avoid human space. No more cubs will be sent against them until we have studied them further. Nodded, but he knew it was not enough. They had made an enemy today, whether they realized it or not. The human woman had let him live to deliver a message, and that message was clear. Humans were not prey. They had never been prey. They were something else entirely. They were apex predators. And the galaxy was about to learn what that meant. Lieutenant Commander Grace Murphy was rescued 4 days after the incident in the jungle. A shuttle from her ship, the UEN Constellation, finally managed to punch through the atmospheric interference and locate her emergency beacon, which she had managed to repair on the 3rd day. They found her sitting on a rock beside a small river, calmly cleaning her wounds with water she had boiled over a makeshift fire. She was thin and pale and covered in scars, but she was alive. The rescue team had expected to find a traumatized survivor, broken by her ordeal. Instead, they found their commanding officer asking about the status of her ship and whether anyone had figured out why the shuttle had crashed in the first place. Sir, said Lieutenant Cooper, the head of the rescue team, are you all right? We found evidence of hunters in the area. Did they find you? Grace looked up at the young officer and smiled. It was a tired smile, but there was something in her eyes that made Cooper take an involuntary step back. They found me, she said. They will not be coming back. She did not elaborate, and Cooper did not ask for details. Some things were better left unsaid. The journey back to the Constellation took about 3 hours. Grace spent most of it in the shuttle's medical bay, having her wounds properly treated by the ship's doctor. The gash in her side would leave a scar, but there was no permanent damage. She had been lucky. Or skilled, the doctor was not sure which. When they finally docked with the Constellation, Grace went directly to the bridge. Her first officer, a young man named, looked up in surprise as she walked through the door. "Commander, we did not expect you back on duty so soon. The doctor said you should rest for at least a week." Grace settled into her command chair and pulled up the navigation display. "I will rest when I am dead. What is our status?" Hesitated, then decided not to argue. He had served under Commander Murphy for 2 years, and he had learned that arguing with her was usually pointless. "All systems nominal, sir. We have been holding position in orbit while waiting for your rescue. Fleet Command has been asking for updates every few hours." "Tell them I am fine, and we will be resuming our mission shortly." Grace studied the navigation display for a moment. "Have there been any other in this sector?" "No, sir. In fact, we have received reports that ships have been actively avoiding this region for the past few days. We are not sure why." Grace allowed herself a small smile. "I might have an idea." She leaned back in her chair and looked out at the stars through the main viewport. Somewhere out there, a pack leader was telling his people about the human woman who had killed 7 of their hunters. Somewhere out there, they were learning that humans were not what they had assumed. Good. Humanity had spent centuries proving itself to the galaxy. They had fought wars against species that considered them inferior. They had colonized worlds that should have been impossible to settle. They had survived plagues and disasters and conflicts that would have destroyed lesser civilizations. And they had done it all through the same qualities that had allowed a single wounded woman to defeat 8 alien hunters in a hostile jungle. Determination, ingenuity, refusal to surrender. Grace did not know what the future would bring. She did not know if they would seek revenge or learn their lesson. She did not know what other challenges awaited humanity among the stars. But she knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, humanity would face it the same way they had faced everything else. They would adapt, they would overcome, they would survive. Because that was what humans did. And the galaxy was only just beginning to understand what that meant. The database was updated 3 months after the incident on 442B. A new entry was added to the species classification system, replacing the previous entry that had listed humans as a viable target for hunting rights. The new entry was short and simple. It contained a single image, captured from the helmet camera of a young hunter named in the moments before his death. The image showed a small human female dropping from a tree above him, her face twisted into an expression of cold determination. Beneath the image, a single notation had been added. Species, human Homo. Classification, apex predator. Threat level, maximum. Hunting status, prohibited. And in smaller text below that, a warning that would be passed down through generations of hunters. They do not stop, they do not surrender, they do not give up, do not hunt them, do not provoke them, do not underestimate them, they are not prey, they never were. The cubs who read that entry would never forget it. They would pass the warning to their own cubs, and those cubs would pass it to theirs. And whenever a young asked why humans were different from other species, their elders would tell them the story of Pack Leader and the human woman in the jungle. They would tell them about the traps and the wire and the 7 hunters who died in minutes. They would tell them about the smile on the human's face as she offered their ancestor a choice between flight and death. And they would tell them the words that had whispered when he first smelled the human's blood and realized what he was truly facing. That's Apex. Those 2 words would become a legend among a reminder that the most dangerous creatures in the galaxy were not the ones with the biggest claws or the sharpest teeth. They were the ones who refused to be prey. They were the ones who turned hunts around. They were humans, and the galaxy would never forget it. Grace Murphy retired from the United Earth Navy 5 years after the incident on 442B. She was 57 years old, and her body had finally started to slow down in ways that she could not ignore. The wound in her side ached on cold days, and her reflexes were not quite what they had been. But she did not go quietly. Her retirement ceremony was held on Earth, at the Navy headquarters in Geneva. Hundreds of officers attended, including several admirals and the Secretary of the Navy herself. Grace stood at attention in her dress uniform, her chest covered with medals and ribbons that represented 3 decades of service. The Secretary gave a speech about Grace's career, highlighting her many accomplishments: the Siege of Titan Station, the Battle of Colony, the incident on 442B, which had become famous throughout human space as the first documented case of a human defeating a hunting party alone. When the speech was over, the Secretary presented Grace with a final medal, the Star of Terra, the highest honor that could be given to a member of the Navy. Grace accepted it with a simple nod. She had never cared much about medals. What mattered to her was simpler than that. She had done her duty. She had protected her crew and her species. She had survived. That was enough. After the ceremony, Grace returned to Montana, to the small town where she had grown up. She bought a cabin in the mountains, not far from the place where she had watched cargo ships pass overhead as a child. She spent her days hiking through the forests and fishing in the streams and watching the stars at night. Sometimes, young Navy officers would visit her, eager to hear stories about her career. Grace would invite them in for coffee and tell them about the things she had seen and done, about the battles and the discoveries and the close calls that should have killed her but somehow did not. And sometimes, when the night was dark and the stars were bright, she would tell them about the jungle and the hunt and the 7 cubs who had died because they underestimated their prey. She would tell them about Pack Leader and the choice she had given him. She would tell them about the message she had wanted to send. "Humans are not prey," she would say, her voice soft but firm. "We never have been. We clawed our way to the top of the food chain on Earth, and we will do the same thing out there among the stars. Not because we are the strongest or the fastest or the most dangerous, but because we never give up, because we never stop fighting, because we refuse to accept defeat." She would look up at the stars, at the countless worlds where humans now lived and worked and built their futures. That is what makes us apex predators, not our bodies, our minds, our spirits, our absolute refusal to be anything other than what we are. The young officers would listen in silence, their eyes wide, their minds racing with images of what their commanding officer had done in that alien jungle so many years ago. And when they left, they would carry her words with them. They would remember the story of Grace Murphy and the hunters. They would remember what it meant to be human. They would remember what it meant to be apex. Grace died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 89, surrounded by her family and friends. Her funeral was attended by thousands of people, from admirals to enlisted soldiers to ordinary civilians who had heard her story and wanted to pay their respects. She was buried in the mountains of Montana, not far from her cabin, with a simple headstone that bore her name and the dates of her life. Beneath those, a single phrase was carved into the stone: "That's Apex." The words became a rallying cry for humanity. They were painted on ships and tattooed on soldiers and whispered by children who dreamed of the stars. They represented everything that humanity was and everything they aspired to be. And somewhere among the stars, they continued to warn their cubs about the small, soft creatures who had proven themselves to be the most dangerous predators in the galaxy. They told stories about the human woman in the jungle, about her traps and her determination and her refusal to die. They told their cubs to never underestimate humans, to never provoke them, to never ever hunt them. Because humans were apex predators. And apex predators were never, ever prey. The end.